Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to invite everybody to consider the bases of multilateralism and the objectives sought by the Founding Fathers when they envisaged this global governance system. During the 75th session of our General Assembly, we engaged in a lengthy discussion here at the United Nations about, and we wish to reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism. An important declaration was adopted during the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. This aptly reflects the new multilateral ambition which we have embraced, an ambition which we hope to see more just and equitable, and to show us that we are the engines of the global development and growth that is sustained. Today, we are called upon to adopt concrete measures to tackle the plethora of challenges which weaken our world, inter alia, terrorism, security challenges, not to mention COVID-19. However, unfortunately, we cannot but note, but far too often we trample upon our multilateral commitments. At times we strip them of all of their meaning, their strength, their roots. Ladies and gentlemen, how else can we understand the fact that the Security Council of the United Nations remains so exclusive? Why not work in good faith towards reform of this important organ of the international security system by making it more reflective of present-day international realities? Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, after this analysis, we come to the following conclusions. Today, we are convinced that African countries, or Africa in general, no longer wish to align themselves with great powers, regardless of who they may be, due to the shortcomings of the concept and the failure of the concept of multilateralism. The role assigned to Africa in the 21st century reflects the image that some powers still hold vis-à-vis our continent, seeing it as exclusively their zone of influence. Africa has almost no impact on the current global order, and yet Africa endures the devastating consequences of upheavals of international society. Africa, in the eyes of certain powers, is only of interest when they are finding themselves in difficulty. There's a need to consider the role of Africa and the place that Africa holds on the world stage. Today, Africa no longer holds the place that it deserves on the international stage. For a number of powers, Africa as a continent does not have a role to play as a major actor in the Kantian sense on the world stage. They think they live in the same world at a time when the world has changed profoundly, when the United Nations was created in 1945. With the exception of two African countries, which we all know, Liberia and Ethiopia, the countries of Africa were not yet independent. After 77 years, it is the same international system, unfortunately, which persists owing to the will of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, who we all know. Although the African integration project is still a work in progress, a consensus has been reached between African states at the level of the African Union, as was recalled during the 77th session, this session, by the President of Senegal, President of the African Union, vis-à-vis the need for the continent to secure 2 permanent seats at the Security Council, in addition to 2 non-permanent seats for African states. Despite this general consensus of 54 African states, the reluctance of certain members of the P5, the reluctance to see Africa occupy this place, stands in stark relief. Unfortunately, the voice of Africa seems not to be heard because some simply do not wish to see Africa be a strong continent. The great powers wish to boil Africa down to a purely instrumental entity for the service of their causes, and they clearly do not wish to see Africa play an important role, a key role in the world. They frequently endeavor to prompt and encourage Africans to stick to their narrative, and ultimately Africans usefully are used to support one side against another. When the discussion turns to voting on a resolution at the Security Council, we are actively solicited on both sides. Africa is often courted, even subject to pressure by some of its partners. These mindsets and actions are anachronistic. They take shape in a historic context where Africa has become cognizant of its own responsibility, when Africa increasingly speaks in a single voice. The fractures of the colonial era between an Africa that is said to be French-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, Arabic-speaking, English-speaking, etc., have dwindled, as have the post-Cold War ideologies that dominated throughout the second half of the 20th century. Today, Africa wishes to remain Africa. Africa and African-speaking Africa, if I may put it that way. Present-day Africa is not the Africa of 1945, certainly not the Africa of the 1960s. Today in Africa, we have a plethora of new partners who are an integral part of the new international geopolitical landscape, a far cry from the 2 anachronistic blocks that structured the world in the post-war 20th century. The world has shifted toward multipolarism. To paraphrase Blaise Pascal, the world has become a whole whose center is both everywhere and nowhere. And Africa cannot and will no longer be a carriage of a single locomotive. Many African countries today, in truth, are very much entwined, and no longer entwined in terms of regimentation. They are no longer linked and bound by colonial history. They are very much keen to work with new partners. All of these changes linked to history itself and the perpetual future, but also the patent will to adopt a paradigm shift in terms of cooperation in Africa. And this should prompt certain powers to adopt a software change, so to speak, if they wish to continue to work with the Africans. There is a challenge for a shift in mindset, a shift in conduct among our partners. Without exception, they look towards Africa with agendas that are dictated by their own interests. Africa now expects more equality, respect, equity, and justice in its relationships and partnerships with the rest of the world, with the great powers, regardless of who they may be. Today, the Africans wish to be real partners for the rest of the world. In the concert of nations, there is a need for Africa to be heard, for dialogue, to have a purpose. The inability to listen perverts the purpose of dialogue, morphing it into a juxtaposition of monologues, partial reasonings, at times in the guise of pseudo-multilateralism, whose danger resides in the distortion of the relationship. And yet in today's world, it is only by pooling our intelligence that we can reach agreement on the goals to be achieved together. Although the essential issues of our time remain unchanged, the understanding of the same issues diverges when one considers the South, when one considers the North. On the major international issues, listening to African voices cannot be simply an adjustment in discussions. Africa certainly doesn't have the same megaphones that the great powers of the world do. However, the voice of Africa counts, and it needs to count if we wish to see Africa as a partner on the major international issues. In the meantime, Africa expects a genuine partnership, and our allies need to make an effort to embrace the spirit of this kind of a partnership. Our allies cannot each time secure the unconditional support of Africa. Africa wishes to cooperate with its allies on the basis of issues, including our interests being taken into account. To achieve this, there is a need for our partners to abandon the fancies that were largely forged in the 19th and 20th century, and they are clearly dissonant with the 21st century challenges, a century when national and regional challenges have global implications and global challenges have regional, national, even local consequences and ramifications. Economic repercussions and upheavals at the international level are direct consequences of the restoration of war in Europe, and this bears that out. We are all, in truth, all facing the same challenges and threats which imperil our survival and our existence. However, we firmly believe that we can build a prosperous world, more stable and more secure and safe for our people through enhanced and efficient and revitalized multilateralism. To that end, we have a single choice: to, under the aegis of the United Nations, to restore strength and determination in our collective capacity for dialogue, resilience, and solidarity, to help us make our planet once again habitable for all, and together and in a sustainable way to build the world which we share. We can, and this is something which we believe very sincerely, we can read the founding text, learn to respect and consider the smallest, the weakest, and the most vulnerable. Yes, we believe that another world is possible. We are all condemned in that regard, and here once again I will paraphrase the eminent Albert Einstein on the subject of war. I do not know how the Third World War will be fought, but I know there will not be much of a world to see the fourth. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration and Togolese Abroad of Togo.